Hello and welcome back to Wolf's Corner. I am your host, and today we are returning to Vraks. Last time we looked at the preparations the Imperium was making to retake the world from the traitors, specifically gathering an army of soldiers so determined to make up for their ancestors' failings that they have no problem charging butt-arse naked at the enemy, singing praises to the Emperor with only a rusty piece of metal in their hands. Meanwhile, the Cardinals' forces were busy tearing themselves apart to establish a who has the biggest dick / suck up to the Cardinals list, while also churning out raging psychopathic killing machines. Oh yeah, and pulling a bunch of unprotected psychers out of the deepest, dankest dungeons and readying them to fight on their side. Now we're going to see the opening phases of this siege and the first signs that the siege will not go the way the Imperial strategists hoped. In other words, all those nice little lists of number of dead are going to have to be written over in red ink because they messed up. Whoops! To start off the campaign, the commander of the whole Imperial war effort, Lord Commander Zuhelk, who has a very lovely name, did not even set up his command post on Vraks. Oh no, that was too close to the front for him. Instead, he set up his command on a nearby world, Thracian Primaris. If there was ever an example of a Chateau General, this guy would be up for that award. This general was a son of a well-connected noble family in the Segmentum Solar. His great-grandfather was an aide to the Lord Commander Solar, who happened to reside on Terra. He literally got his position thanks to family connections and the pressure they could put on their buddies. But this is the way of business in the Imperium in the 41st millennium. His belief was that, hey, the Imperial war machine is in motion, and there's no stopping it. There's no need for me to actually go to the world I'm fighting for. I can set myself up here nice and cozy and make sure all the supplies and replacements keep getting through. Yeah, the Kriegsmen did not have many people caring much about them, and that was just how they preferred it. And 1 year after the first Death Corps troopers landed on the planet, they were ready to start the siege. The plan of attack was simple. The Imperial forces would launch 2 main attacks coming from the west and from the north, breaching the first defensive line at both places. The main points of attack are right here, here, and here. They needed to do this as quickly as possible, regardless of the number of dead, though that last part was something the Death Corps did not care about anyway. There was a reason for this rush to get through the first line, of course. Once they were through it, the Imperial forces could actually begin a proper encirclement of the traitors' positions, and slowly but steadily work their way up to take out the second defensive line, all around a well-organized timetable that ensured not one single thing went absolutely horribly wrong. Once they were close enough, the commanders of the guardsmen would be able to take their time probing the second line for weak spots before punching right through them. According to the Administratum plans, once the guardsmen were through, they could once again start approaching the final defensive line in a nice, carefully planned assault until they brought their big guns into range. Once that happened, all the Death Corps had to do was sit and hold their line while the artillery pummeled the traitors' fortifications and people into dust. Pretty straightforward, but as in all aspects of war, nothing was ever so straightforward. The official beginning of the Imperial assault was the morning of year fraction 166, year 813, M41, when the Krieg artillery began a massive bombardment. Earthshaker and bombard shells tore the outer defensive line apart all morning to the point that the barrels of the guardsmen's cannons glowed red hot. So that means that each one of the guns would have fired several hundred shells in quick succession to start making them glow. Think about that for a second. Now, the traitors may have been a relatively disorganized bunch of religious fanatics and disgruntled ex-soldiers, but nobody likes being tossed around like a rag doll by artillery. So to solve the problem of being pounded into the ground like a piece of hamburger, the traitor artillery began to return fire. Even though they had time to train on using their guns, the traitors were not artillery marksmen. Their first shells fell short, then wide. But finally, they started to get closer and closer to the Krieg artillery. Eventually, one shell managed to hit one of the Earthshaker cannons, detonating its ammunition, and killing its 8-man crew. Ouch. Now, this was a lucky hit at the furthest range of the traitor artillery, but it still told the guardsmen that this was not going to be the case of their artillery being the only guns smashing positions to pieces. While the artillery were duking it out and clobbering the defensive lines, the 1st Death Corps troops advanced. These were members of the 158th Regiment who steadily advanced even while the artillery shells were flying over their heads. If these weren't Death Corps guardsmen, I imagine there would have been quite a few browned pants which did not come from the ash under their boots. But the soldiers of Krieg simply marched forward at a steady pace until they reached the planned position. Once they got there, they began to dig, and dig, and dig. The Imperial plan was not to start the actual attack just yet. They wanted the artillery to soften the hamburger up, and the bombardment was the perfect cover for the infantry to get into position to set up their staging ground. By the time night fell, the soldiers had dug their first slit trenches where they could wait for the night as the artillery continued firing. Over the next few days, the first slit trenches were extended and improved to become squad trenches, then platoon trenches, then company trenches, and so on, in the work to becoming a more permanent position. At the same time, the Death Corps used the nights to lay fields of razor wire in front of their trenches, so that the traitors did not use the darkness to sneak inside and slit their throats. The trenches also filled with heavy weapon teams who sighted and dug their weapons in to protect the trenches during attacks and defense. This was all done in a methodical and efficient process, the standard for the Death Corps regiments as they had been trained to do back on their homeworld. Of course, while they were doing this, the traitors were also preparing. They massed their soldiers directly in front of the guardsmen, hiding them inside strongholds that survived through the continuous bombardment. And in front of them, there were thousands of mines, tank traps, ditches, and razor wire. This was the Western Front of the First World War on cocaine and steroids. And with that image in mind, you can probably imagine what was going to happen next. 46-year fractions after the first artillery bombardment of the Imperial guns, because when it comes to Imperial dates, the bureaucracy of the Administratum rules all things. The soldiers of the 149th Regiment prepared for the first assault against the outer defensive line of Cardinal Zaphan's traitors. This assault would be located in a place named as cold and clinically chosen as the Death Corpsmen themselves. Sector 46-39. This spot was chosen because the intelligent forces of the Imperial suggested this would have been the perfect place to crack open under an assault. Of course, the first thing the guardsmen should have been taught is that the phrase military intelligence is an oxymoron. But it did not matter to the Krieg soldiers. While the 149th Regiment would be forming the assault, it would be supported by the 143rd and 150th Regiments on its flanks to keep the traitors from smashing into the main assault from 3 directions. At the same time, tanks from the 11th Assault Corps were waiting behind the infantry's lines. If this assault worked, then these tanks would rush through the breach and tear into the rear area of the traitors' defensive lines. The plan was for 500,000 infantry to attack in waves against this sector's defenses. I stand by my statement that this campaign is a shining example of the realities of the universe in Warhammer 40k. The very first attack wave of this assault was expected to fail in successfully breaching the trenches, but their sacrifice would give away the weak points for the second line of guardsmen to smash through. This attack would be led by elite Death Corps grenadiers to actually achieve a breach of the lines. These troops were chosen by their superiors for this position for one reason or another. It was not a promotion to be made a grenadier, it was a duty. But as you can see, these guys got much better equipment than the rest of their fellows, and they would need it. In the Imperial plans, this second wave would make a hole that would be expanded by a third wave of the assault. After this, the tanks would rush through. Of course, this would not happen before heavy bombardment blew the sector and the areas next to it into pieces for days before the call to go over the top. As the start of the offensive approached, the soldiers and guns began to mass in front of the target. Everything from the platoon mortars up to the giant bombard cannons were set to fire at various targets in the sector and the areas behind it. To make sure this offensive had the firepower to succeed, the Guard had set aside over 4 million shells of all calibers just for this attack. After all the bombardments and preparations the guardsmen had been doing since the start of the siege, this would be the biggest one so far. And the artillery of the 21st Bombardment Corps prepared themselves to commence 5 days of blasting apart the defenses in a more concentrated focus than any other artillery bombardment previously. By year fraction 212 of the year 813, this first companies were ready to go over the top. As the guardsmen waited in their forward trenches, no doubt many had a small touch of fear in the back of their minds. But the men and women of Krieg were not like other people. They were ready to die for their emperor as their guns intensified their bombardment for the final stage of preparation to be complete. Then, at the designated time, to the second, all at once, the battlefield went silent. This was not some mistake or confusion about the bombardment. The plan was exact, and the guardsmen in the front line trenches knew there was not going to be one more blast of artillery shells to soften up the enemy. As soon as the bombardment stopped, the order they'd been waiting for was given. The Death Corps advanced over the top of their trenches. The lines of guardsmen advanced forward through their own razor wire and the craters in no man's land. The hunched figures of the guard kept going, right in the sights of the traitors' guns. Because while the Death Corps guns had blasted the ever-living shite out of the trenches in front of the advance, the traitors had managed to survive in deep, well-built bunkers that held out against the guns of the Imperium. And as soon as the bombardment stopped, the traitor soldiers rushed out of these bunkers and set up their heavy weapons aimed right at the guardsmen. As soon as the soldiers had advanced slightly more than 20 yards from their trenches, the traitors' guns opened up as one. Even as they were cut down like blades of wheat, the guardsmen of Krieg kept advancing as they had, making matters worse for the guardsmen that they were advancing across ground already pre-sighted by traitor artillery, and now those guns added to the hellstorm the guardsmen were marching into. Eventually, even these resolute soldiers had to start finding cover in the shell craters that had torn no man's land apart. Every time an officer tried to urge their soldiers forward, they made themselves a quick and easy target for enemy fire. All the time this slaughter was going on, the next squads waited in the trenches with their bayonets fixed, ready to go. In spite of the sounds coming from the land in front of their trenches, the guardsmen still began to climb over the top when the order to advance came. And immediately many of these guardsmen were hit from the traitors' weapons and fell back right on top of their fellows still inside the trenches. Guardsmen who did manage to actually get out of their trenches could not even get 10 yards before the fire from the enemy forced them to take cover. Of course, soldiers always find a way to get through incredible obstacles, and in some places, squads of guardsmen actually reached the traitors' lines. There they fought up close and personal with bayonets on their lasguns and throwing grenades into every corner and potential ambush point. And they needed to do this, because while the guardsmen of Krieg were resolute in their willingness to die for their emperor, their enemy was just as determined to resist them. While some units succeeded in reaching the line, in other areas, this was not the case. For example, Sector 469-391 had no platoons even reach the enemy trench. And in the case of one company's 9 platoons, which numbered around 600 soldiers, only 58 were alive at roll call that evening. Not enough to make up a single platoon. Talk about attritional warfare. From 9 platoons to not even 1 in a single assault. Now you might think that this level of slaughter would constitute grounds for the assault to be called off and the artillery to resume firing in order to soften up the defenses some more so the second wave could actually get through, right? Don't be ridiculous! This is the Death Corps of Krieg we're talking about. And if we learned anything about these nameless mass soldiers, it's that casualties are not a concern for them. It's expected. So while the first wave died in no man's land, the second wave moved forward with the grenadiers leading the way with their heavier guns, armor, and grenades all clanking with each step. On cue, the second wave scaled up the ladders and right into the waiting fire of the traitors. The only thing that ended the killing was night. Then only the star shells fired by either side every so often to illuminate the battlefield, and the wounded who had the strength to pull themselves back to their trenches were moving. Out in the land between the trenches, some guardsmen stayed under cover, still trying to push on to their objectives in spite of the odds against them. When morning came, the third wave pressed on. Like the last two waves, they merely died in the land between the two positions without breaking through anywhere. After this failed attempt to get through, the forces still alive pulled back into their lines, right in time for the traitors to launch a counterattack the next day, thinking that the front lines would be weak due to the heavy casualties they inflicted on the Imperial units. But as they scaled over their own trenches, they realized they'd overlooked one very important detail. The Death Corps assaults had left all their heavy weapons inside the trenches when they had advanced, and now those weapons were manned and pointed right at them. And the Krieg discipline and methodical fighting style blunted the traitors' attack with the help of the heavy mortars and short-range quad launchers blowing the traitors sky high the same way they had done to the Imperial assault. Soon, the only movement in no man's land were the rats coming out of their hiding holes to feast on the dead. The vicious fighting ended after the 3 days, but the artillery battle continued. After this attempt to break through the lines, the front settled down as a maze of trenches expanded across the wastes over the following weeks, as the only action involved the continual artillery duel and the ever-constant patrols and trench raids. Each night, the patrols of both sides would go out and either lay or discover minefields and find holes in the enemy's wire for another raid to use. This constant routine was costing the 88th Siege Army 2,000 men a day. An army today bleeding this number of men would be spent in a matter of weeks. But for the Imperial military, this was no problem. Those sloths in the administratum were very good at planning out casualties, and they had planned for these. So while the guardsmen regiments were hemorrhaging soldiers, they were getting reinforced daily to replace their losses in the same way they get resupplies of ammunition and food. And this was the case for the first year of the siege. Constant wearing down of both sides locked in a grinding stalemate. When the 814th year of M41 drew close to an end, the 261st Regiment of the 30th Line Corps was finally given an order to attack. After 6 months where the regiment more or less sat on its arse, they had an order to launch a probing attack across their entire front. The 9th Company of this regiment was given the duty to attack a strong point designated Fort A-453. So crafty, these Kriegsmen with their names. Under the cover of a heavy smokescreen made from the artillery bombardment supporting the assault, the 9th Company managed to actually reach the traitors' trenches and hunker down in the entrance of a personnel shelter right as traitor artillery pounded the ground around them. Sending a runner back to the regiment to inform their commanders of their situation, the poor sod spent several hours getting back across no man's land to friendly trenches, and then even more time to reach the 30th Corps' command post to report to the commanding general about the success of the 9th Company. The next day, the commander of the corps sent grenadiers forward to link up with the 9th as they fought through the galleries and corridors of the fort in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Several times the traitors tried to literally burn the 9th Company out with flamers, but slowly the Death Corps troops worked their way through the fort, clearing it of enemies. While that brutal fighting was occurring, 3 companies from the 6th Tank Regiment of the 11th Assault Corps supporting the 30th approached the fort. They had come with a Baneblade super heavy tank in the front, as well as Atlas excavators which had been equipped to neutralize the tank ditches blocking access to the fort. Just as the tanks prepared to engage the troops they saw on the fort's walls, they were stopped when it became clear that they were the 261st Regiment. The Death Corps had secured the fort. With this stronghold gone, the traitor forces of Cardinal Zaffan were left unable to hold their first defensive line. In stark contrast to the disciplined Death Corps forces, the traitors had panicked when they heard that the fort had fallen and rushed troops from all over their line to try and recapture the position before the Death Corps could exploit the breach. This, of course, left the rest of their line undermanned and vulnerable to attack, which is precisely the opportunity that Death Corps exploited as the 8th Assault Corps smashed through the gaps in the traitors' lines and rolled them all up. With that, the traitors fled their now indefensible positions and made their way back towards the second line of defenses. Of course, the guardsmen did not let them simply withdraw. Elite Death Rider companies harassed the enemy hard all the way back to their new line. Afterwards, it was simply a matter of mopping up several traitor units that had been left behind in the retreat and cut off by the Imperial advance. As that was finished, the guardsmen settled into their new positions. The first objective of the Siege of Vraks had been won. And that is where we end this video, with the Imperium advancing and the traitor Cardinal fearing the dawning Imperial retribution that was coming for him. But there's a long road ahead before this campaign is concluded, and things would not be going so well for the Imperium soon. Thank you for watching this video, and all who have subscribed to this channel. Please stick around as we continue with the Siege of Vraks and the changing fortunes for both sides. Also, if you want to suggest any topics for after these videos, please add them down in the comments. And as before, for more good Warhammer lore and stories, check out the channel links in the description. This is the Wolf's Corner. Have a good day.